Majulah semua. Majulah dia. Satu lagi.
Yes, any more people?
Masala boleh. Okay, hi guys. In opening government, we have opening government. In opening opposition, we have one. And closing government, we have Masala Thosai. In closing opposition, we have Yale-NUS. I'm the chair, my name is Deborah and Kimara. On my right is Serena, she's from UMT. My left, Carol from UKM, and further on my left, Chris, also from Kimara. I call this house to order. Without further ado, congratulations to all teams making it to this quarterfinals. So may I please have the Prime Minister to speak on the motion which stands at his knee.
We're going to start off the idea that we think that sexuality is, in fact, in reality, a choice. That everything to do with sexuality and the execution of this sexuality is a choice that individuals make every day of their lives in order to identify themselves in a certain way, whether they think that they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, straight, or any of the other characteristics that they actively take part in. Another thing that we need to realize is that individuals or sexuality as a concept is something that should and is a fluid spectrum, which means that we think that individuals can choose to identify themselves along any line of the spectrum, whether they think that they tend more towards being heteronormative or whether they think they tend more towards being heterosexual. We also think that the idea of sexuality being executed or as a choice, the execution of sexuality as a choice, is something that is fundamental to like the decisions they make every day. So for instance, the way that they choose to present themselves to the world, whether man chooses to wear, like, for example, maroon pants, he may be presenting a certain ideal to the world that or a certain type of sexuality to the world that he actually identifies himself with. Also things like the things that they say or the places that they go, whether they want to go to gay bars or how many people they want to know about their sexuality, are all things that we think these individuals also make decisions about. As far as we think that predispositions can exist, as in like people are born with certain predispositions, we also think that these predispositions can be changed over the course of a person's lifetime. And in fact, that it has been proven or can be shown to a certain extent that these ideas of sexuality are things that do change over time and are actively or actually the choice that individuals make about themselves. So what is it that we need to recognize in today's debate? What the LGBTIQ movement actually stands for is the idea that we shouldn't be against discrimination for things that are completely arbitrary and baseless and don't actually have effects on other people. So to the extent that we recognize sexuality is a choice, we think that this is not a choice that actively hurts or undermines anyone else's rights or abilities to do anything, right? For this reason, we think that what we actually stand for, the aims of the movement, is actually to be against, or the principle of it is to be against ideas of discrimination on completely arbitrary grounds, like the choice that you make in terms of your sexuality. Understanding this, let's move on to the first point that we have today. Why is it that we think that just principally speaking, the LGBT movement should abandon this line of them being of sexuality not being a choice for these individuals? The first reason we think is because it's the most expensive and inclusive way that these movements can present themselves, right? So let's just understand something. Individuals can choose exactly how big or small they want sexuality to play in the course of their lifetime, right? So an individual, for instance, can make sexuality weigh up against the other considerations in their life, for example, if they have a competing priority in terms of religion. They can choose instead to abandon or not emphasize the ideas of sexuality in their life in favor of things like religion. These are choices that people make every day, and we think the LGBTQIA movement should respect that level of autonomy and respect these individuals in terms of like understanding that individuals who do identify themselves as certain sexualities should be included in that sense. Yes, Patrick.
Kanna, even if we accept the idea that some people think that sexuality is a choice, what about for the large percentage of people who really truly believe that sexuality is a choice and the LGBTQ movement is shutting them out of this kind of discourse?
Right. So on to the second part of this idea, right? We think that this particular line of logic that sexuality is a choice is something that actually includes or does not discriminate against those people who choose to identify themselves as being born a particular sexuality as well. So on the idea that if you think that you change your sexuality or things like that, we think that the movement provides the avenue for you as well. But to the extent that you believe that you are born a particular way, we think that the narrative is that people should just not discriminate against you for the ideas of things like sexuality. So they actually fight for these rights for you as well. But what's even more important, we think, is that what happens right now is that because of the way the movement is defined, the LGBTQ movement identifies itself as something that wants to include as many people as possible, that people should not be discriminated on the basis of sexuality and these other criteria. We think it's incredibly contradictory for these individuals to therefore say that there are only specific kinds of sexualities or only specific things that you can be born into that you are born into that should therefore be included in the protection of these rights. But what's even worse is that the common criticism of the LGBTQ movement is that they are not inclusive enough, that they actively marginalize or discriminate, no thank you sir, against various sexualities that don't fall nicely within a spectrum of certain categories that are defined by them. So for example, if you're not completely a lesbian or if you're not completely bisexual or you're just unsure where your sexuality are, there's very little place for you in this in this movement for these individuals to be able, no thank you sir, to gain any form of traction. And the problem is, because the LGBT movement is fighting for these rights, these tend to be ideas that even after after the ideas of acceptance has spread, these are things that generally stick to these individuals and make it even harder for these marginalized groups to gain equality in any sense of the word. So what's the second idea that we're going to bring to you today? We actually think that pragmatically speaking, above and beyond just the principal ideas, we think it's far better for them to identify themselves this way, just because we think it's much easier for their narrative to therefore gain traction. No, thank you. So why is this so? Right now, the way that individuals view the LGBT individuals, given that they are thought of being as born this way, is that these people are somehow innately different from straight people as human beings. In fact, the common invective or the common criticism of these people and the common arguments used against them is that they are precisely sinners or they're born as heathen, because these are individuals that were born different and are now somehow others the quality of the other from individuals. And these are not people that can be changed and therefore deserve to be discriminated and marginalized against. What happens when you actually forward the line instead that sexuality is a choice? Then you begin to realize, or you are forced to realize, that these individuals are no different from you as a human being, that they are fundamentally or intrinsically not any different from you and are simply choosing to make, no thank you sir, different life decisions from the individual. Why is this good for the LGBTQ movement? Because now, when sexuality becomes a choice, these individuals, when they are seen as similar to you, there's now an added reason for individuals to actually engage with these these LGBTQ members in the kind of discourse. So yes, the discourse may be along the lines of things like, for example, you should change your sexuality for certain so and so reasons. But we think that it's far more important that you push the discourse towards ideas or logical reasons as to why certain choices are bad or why certain choices are objectively better than others. At the very least, we think that the idea that or the perception or removing the perception that these LGBT individuals are somehow fundamentally different from you is actually a good thing, because it just ensures that you have better acceptance. But we also think that the changing of the discourse and changing of the narrative to ensure that we actually talk about why these people are different or reasons why a person's sexuality is chosen or what the reasons why a certain person may choose to identify themselves is a good thing for the movement as well. For these reasons, the speaker, we propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Now, starting with side opposition, how to call on the leader of opposition.
The as a political movement that seeks to be inclusive cannot pick and choose to ignore a huge segment, in fact, the most discriminated people of the conservative, especially when you talk about homosexualities in conservative societies, and those are the biggest stakeholders that they are choosing to ignore. Before going to my substantive, 3 rebuttals. First, we think it's highly offensive and in fact dismissive to just dismiss the idea that some people can believe that they are born that way. But some people, when they grow up in an environment and they believe that from young I've always chose like more feminine traits. From young I've always not liked to play guy toys. I've always liked to be addressed a certain way or play girl toys. But when you grow up in that environment and that idea of choice was never presented to you and asked you, do you want to be a heterosexual or a homosexual? The intrinsic belief of these people is that I am born that way and there's nothing that I can do about it. The moment that you tell these people that homosexuality is merely a choice and all that you do and all the persecution, all the fear of you going out on the street and be called a faggot is merely a result of your own choice, we think it's offensive and it antagonizes this specific group of people further away from your movement. Second, we have to respect the autonomy and choice for people to have different ideas on the spectrum of sexuality. We think that's okay, we stand perfectly and we perfectly agree that people should respect those forms of autonomy. But that's not mutually exclusive, with also recognizing the far end of the spectrum where people do believe that they are born that way. Thirdly, the idea that people are born this way intrinsically suggests the idea that, I'll take you in a bit. The idea that homosexualities are born that way shows that they are inherently different people and therefore we cannot identify with them. But that same argument can go with women who are intrinsically born as women or like racial minorities who are intrinsically born as racial minorities. Just because you are born that way doesn't mean you disengage other people to have sympathy for you. It doesn't mean you create an inherent difference that people can never empathize with you. We think it's even worse, right? Because their claim is this: these people are born as sinners. But the claim or the discrimination is even worse when the rhetoric now is that you can actively say people can choose to be sinners. So either way, it's not like right or wrong. Either way, not one is worse than the other. It's important for the LGBT movement to choose and to acknowledge all these different kinds of people on the spectrum. Go.
How is amending a singular mainstream narrative that this is not a choice? Any different, or how does it alien people when now you allow them to be more inclusive and respect all the different types of benefits of people that subscribe to their own version of homosexuality?
Side opposition will not stand for a monolithic mainstream discourse that people can only be born into sexuality. In fact, we are the side that embrace the different spectrum. We'll say people can choose to be homosexuals, people can also be born into it. You are the side that wants to abandon the claim that people can be born into being homosexuals. Say, 3 arguments. First, the fact that we have to recognize that people can both be born into homosexuality or choose to be a homosexual means that we will recognize that spectrum, that there is a far end on that spectrum, and all those are okay. And that is what we will see. A political movement as an LGBT movement, it should seek to reflect its members, recognize that all these different people also suffer no matter you are born into it or doesn't matter you choose to be a homosexual, you still experience the same forms of persecution or discrimination in society. Therefore, the movement has to seek to reflect the predicaments or the perils that are faced by its members who also need equal protection from the movement. The movement then cannot be selfish or self-serving, which is why the LGBT movement constantly evolves from LGBT to LGBTIQ to constantly take in more people or different kinds of minority identities because it seeks to be all inclusive. But secondly, we think how you discriminate a very specific group of people who are the worst targets of discrimination. I'm talking about homosexualities in conservative societies. The persecution today is this, that when people choose to be, the persecution is worse for these people when they are born as a homosexual, but they are also at the same time born into a conservative society. Therefore, they cannot have the choice to opt out of homosexuality because they are born that way, and they also cannot have the choice to leave their community because their lives are so deeply entrenched. They suffer the worst form of persecution because if you abandon the claim that they are born that way, then you are telling people and strengthening the claim that these are deviants who actively choose to embrace a hedonistic lifestyle. We think that is bad for two reasons. First, religious people, you make being religious and being homosexual a diametrically opposed choice, which means you can only choose to be religious, or you can be a homosexual, and you cannot choose both, because you cannot argue that God made me this way. You have to abandon the choice to be homosexual if you want to stay close to your religion. We think it forces people to make that form of false choice, which wasn't necessary in the first place. But secondly, we think it diminishes the support for the religious and conservative community, because right now the strongest argument against these people and against those forms of bigotry is that these people are born that way. Your God created them that way. So yes, can we persuade all conservatives to change? No, but as a large chunk of people who are on the middle ground that we can tap into and change those mindsets. Third, how the critical mass is very important for political change. The LGBT movement as a political movement seeks very tangible outcomes, which means they seek to change laws and policy. And those movements and those outcomes can only be achieved if the movement is strategic in being inclusive and being effective, which means they will always need the numerical support, which means it's okay to open up, which is why LGBT became LGBTIQ, because you constantly open up for more and more people to join, which is why you ally with the feminist movement so that you gain that form of critical mass. And those kind of critical mass cannot be achieved when you discriminate a big chunk of people who choose to be homosexual, because now they feel antagonized, they feel that their identity are rejected. That can bring two consequences. First, you have lesser people out there who are actively going out there declaring themselves as homosexual, because they are less courageous, because they have less backing behind them from the LGBT movement. So you cannot achieve of normalizing homosexuality in society. But more importantly, the critical mass then you cannot achieve to pressure politicians past the tipping point. We think those critical mass is important, even in conservative states like Idaho can change those laws. Those are more important, which is why we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Now, can we please have the Deputy Prime Minister? Just hold on. Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, no matter how you like to see it, we are all born differently. But it's not where and how and why we are born that defines us, but the choices that we make on an everyday basis that really constitutes who we are as people. And it's this basis that we've come to embrace, that no matter where you come from, your choice should never be defined by a larger group of people that can tell you what to do, that we celebrate this idea of choice to every single person. And to the extent that individuals who believe that they are born this way continue to exercise this choice of being this way, they also fall into this group and are not excluded. But the true thing is if we can't see past the fact of being born this way or not, we will never get to the crux of what a movement is trying to stand for, which is the celebration of continuing to be the way you are, or being able to define who you want to be in the first place. And we think that should have been the core of the movement, and at the very least, that's where the movement should go towards. There are two important things we need to discuss here. The first is what really is the goal of the LGBTQ movement, and why is it consistent with this side of the motion? And second, my positive material, what then are its responsibilities, and whether or not it is in this following this motion will actually be more consistent with their responsibilities. First, to rather explain it again, because I thought it was fairly well put out in the PM, what we mean is that at its core, if you reduce everything that people stand for as a different person in society, the only real difference really that matters is what you choose to do. And whether or not you choose to continue being a homosexual or not, we don't think it's an important choice in and of itself. It's the choice and ability for every single individual to make these particular decisions that we think is important. And to that extent, all forms of sexuality, or what the LGBTIQ movement at its core really stands for, is the idea that sexuality as a concept should be seen as a choice, and seeing that every person should have the ability to make choices that hurt other people. This is a basis which we think we need to protect, given that is already protected with this law. In principle, what the LGBTIQ movement's goal really is in this constitution is to allow the celebration of choice, and that's why Foley's motion is principally more consistent. That was the first thing we told you when I rebutted. But second, more important, we thought it was also more important, or actually more useful in pushing the movement forward, just garnering support, garnering more discourse. What was the response to this? They said it cannot be self-serving. It cannot leave out individuals who define themselves in different ways, who actually believe that they really are born this way. Sure, and to some extent, when you say that you're called a faggot because of the choices you make, we think that's systematically much better, because bigotry isn't going to go away. But the difference here is this: we much rather these individuals take the brunt for making choices, or making choices that are controversial, than be called controversial, or called faggots, or called lesser than other people just because of the way they are born. Because then there's some autonomy in these particular choices, then there's rationale to why they make these decisions in the first place. It is systematically much worse when you're not bigotry to be based upon what they couldn't define for themselves to begin with, and to say that in and of itself, from the moment you were born, you were already lesser than us to start with. We think choices, given that there's rational abilities which can shape these things and argue about these things, give them considerably more agency defining the characteristics of the choices for themselves. Yes?
As far as I know, you identify yourself as a male. Does the fact that you were born a male have anything to do with this whatsoever?
No, because I can choose to be female. And that is the point, that we shouldn't be defined by what we started from. And that really is the thing that we're trying to say is the goal of that movement. And we said, and I've said this quite a number of times already. But past this, we also think that it's important to understand that at the very core, this enables a better discourse, a better understanding of where rights should go, where rights comes from. At the point in which you make that you're born differently, or we are born this particular way, you make it difficult for people to access that particular discussion at its core. If we say that you can make choices on an everyday basis as long as it doesn't hurt other people, it makes it far more relatable to see individuals as a whole and everyone else. So now I don't have to exorcise you or fundamentally change the way you're born and the way you're constituted such that you may change your decisions. It is far better for this course to the extent you're able to tell these people that there are good rationales and good reasons to why I make these decisions, and engage in discourse and understandings to that extent. And we think the way that people negotiate and react to these particular individuals is far better as a whole. No, thank you. But last of all, we also think that's important for us to understand of how we would deal and react to conservatism as a whole. When we engage with the civil rights movement, the way in which we talk about how individuals or black people should deserve their rights is to say that these individuals are human as well. This is a bit different from saying that they are born this way, because you don't change the perception towards affliction that they think they're born with. Saying that you're born this way doesn't change the fact that you are born with this thing, which is what they already object to. You are saying that I have nothing I can do about this, but doesn't change the way we effectively view that particular thing in and of itself. Yeah. That is why understanding what we do with this thing and the choices we make with this thing is far more important, given that all of us are born with things that people may or may not like about each other. And that is why we constantly make ourselves based around this particular institution of choice, and that is really what we are trying to protect. No, thank you. To the extent that you're saying that these individuals have no other choice, you force people to bring these individuals to camps that force feed these individuals things that they otherwise wouldn't believe in, as opposed to engaging in good discussion that they will then think differently, perhaps, at the end of the day. But that leads me to the second thing about what our responsibilities really are. The crux of this is that we really aren't support, in truth, of the individuals who want to persistently be LGBTIQs or how they define themselves. We're happy to say that individuals should have the option to leave this movement if they want, because that really should be the choice. That we don't think that as the LGBTIQ movement, while your responsibility obviously is to these individual groups, you should not be standing for the oppression of these groups and making them stay within these places as well, or the oppression of other groups. And that's what Sher told you. To the extent that your this movement is characterized by letters in that name because you are born this way, and if you are not, you can't choose to opt into this movement. We think that, first of all, is highly exclusive of everyone else. We're happy to say that individuals who believe that they're born this way can continue to opt to do so, and therefore are part of this movement. But more than that, telling people or voting for a concept that it is your choice enables you or enables individuals to better negotiate the kinds of situations they might find in. We don't think it's necessarily right. Individuals who find themselves in like LGBTIQ positions should have to choose their sexuality over things such as religion. We think every individual should have the ability to make choices of what they believe is important or not. But to the extent that you tell these individuals that you have to stick these ways because you are born this way, and you stand for the movement because you're born this way, you have no other choice, it makes it extremely oppressive to these groups to the extent that they can't choose against what they thought constitutionally is a part of themselves. And that's why they struggle so much against the things that seem to be so diametrically be opposed without realizing that these things can be negotiated in and of itself. And some choices can be made even though they are hard. To the extent that we think people who are homosexual should really choose against or for their religion as opposed to their sexuality, and be able to find a way to reconcile it by realizing that I can escape the things that I was born with in a good, like, sensible discussion. But then this enables this kind of discourse, this kind of choices at the end of the day. And this, we think, is the most responsible route for these particular movements, because it then engages the true core of what it stands for. It doesn't stand just for individuals of that particular character and nature, but it stands for the choices and the directions that they choose to break the destiny that otherwise societies would force on them. That is why I have been focus.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. Now, to conclude, the opening half, and please have the Deputy Leader conversation.
Mr. Speaker, in my speech on the side of the opening opposition, I'm going to offer you two substantives. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why the LGBTIQ movement should focus on the end goals of equality and acceptance, rather than this mischaracterization of whether it should be a choice or whether you are born, whether it's a choice or you are born that way. Secondly, I'm going to tell you in my substantives why it's easier for legislation to then protect homosexuals when you include the premise and the idea that you can inherently be born as a homosexual, and why that's inclusive and best for the movement at large. But before that, thematic rebuttals, right? Let's look at this idea that came out from the entire opening government. They told us that, look, sexuality is an active choice, and you need to acknowledge the fact that these individuals opt towards this active lifestyle, and that the fact that sexuality can change. But this is a strong contention coming from Deborah's speech, right? That not everyone has this avenue of choice or access to this choice. We think that's extremely detrimental, right? When many homosexuals or many gays in general are trapped in very conservative societies, such as in Qatar or Kuwait or in Malaysia, for instance, when you abandon the claim, or when you abandon the idea that homosexuality can be inherently genetic in nature, we think you lose a very big proportion, a critical mass of individuals that can support your movement in terms of fighting for legislature. And we think that's very detrimental towards your case, right? Because your premise can only work for liberal democracies where the idea of choice is already inherently available for these individuals. We think you cannot abandon this idea, you cannot abandon this claim, especially when it comes to a critical point, right? No, thank you. Bryan told us that, look, the movement should celebrate the way we are. Exactly the case, right? We think that individuals who are inherently claim that they are born that way have a better defense against bigots or even religious communities that tell them that, look, you are not born that way. It was an active choice. It was a sinful choice that Roman Catholics throughout the world, especially in Russia, condemn continuously because of the fact that they believe that it is not an inherent choice in nature. No, thank you. Let's look at the second rebuttal, right? Because they told us as well in Bryan's speech that it's then the responsibility, right, that individuals should have the option to choose to leave. But we think that this option that you have the ability to leave whenever you want is also available on the outside, that you can then not choose to be so-called straight in the end. We think that even in the feminist movement, right, many individuals or many women can also opt to leave the movement whenever they want if they are not in line with the goals of feminism or if it has changed in its ideology. We think this is the idea that we have on the outside when we allow individuals to opt for whatever movement or to opt for whatever ideology they want. We don't think that your case is mutually exclusive, right, in this sense. Let's look at the substantive matter that I have for you, Mr. Speaker, and this clashes as well with the last idea that, with the second idea that Bryan had, and that was the goal of the LGBT movement. Let's look at why we should focus on the end goals of equality and acceptance, right? Because in status quo, there's much debate, like in this very room, about whether sexuality should be a choice in terms of environmental factors, or whether you should be born that way genetically. We think in itself, this has created much polarity within the movement. A recent study by Oxford has claimed that there's a chromosome Y. Chromosome Y does inherently have a gay gene in itself. We think that even this debate, in just like last 2 months ago, right, Mr. Speaker, maybe you know, you were at Oxbridge, that contested a lot of debate, not only in Oxford itself, but internationally as well, because a lot of people, it's possible to be inherently born that way. this is the consequence of this study, right? Because number one, there was a lot of religious outcry from Orthodox Christians because they believe that you can choose choosing homosexuality. So homosexuality is a sinful choice. But the most detrimental part, and this is the second part, which that was the division among the homosexuals itself. Because now you perceive that those who choose to be homosexual are now deemed as second-class homosexuals. We think that it's largely detrimental towards the movement because some people believe that if I'm born this way, then maybe that it is my inherent right to be homosexual, but you chose it on environmental factors in itself. We think that this is largely detrimental, especially when Deborah told you that it's extremely crucial to have a critical mass of individuals in order to push for the LGBT movement. We think that this movement should be as inclusive as possible, and that when you acknowledge all spectrums of individuals and not this characterization coming from opening opposition that tells you that no, we only acknowledge people who choose into it. We think resources are taken in a bit, that resources should be channeled towards fighting for social acceptance, right? Rather than having this bigoted debate about whether it's a choice or whether it's genetic in nature. We think all individuals and all people who identify themselves with the LGBT movement should then channel towards the idea of social acceptance, the idea of equality, and that cannot exist when you're bigoted amongst yourselves. Go.
How does sympathy for a medical condition extend or equate to the extending of exclusively secular rights like marriage?
We think the idea of marriage or the legislation to fight for same-sex marriage can only come when you have this critical mass that we are talking about, right? When you tell me that it's an active choice, and when you tell me that look, perhaps that I may opt to choose, I may opt out of it in the end, we think it's better under our side when individuals can respond by saying that, look, we are inherently born this way, therefore we have no other choice, that we want to identify with this genetic coding that we have. We think it's much easier for legislature, for politicians to give you your rights essentially in status quo, right? That leads me to my second substantive essentially. Well, it's easier for legislature than to protect homosexuals. We think when you acknowledge the fact that homosexuality can be genetic, it gives a objective legal defense for the LGBT movement at large. Firstly, against the religious radicals that we talked about, because they will always say that, look, God created you that way. God created you that way now, you can use that as a defense rather than saying that it's a choice and that you have to change. Secondly, we think also that it's easier for politicians to support same-sex marriage rights, right? So even if you are a politician who comes under heavy fire from conservative states, for example, Alabama, for instance, or Texas, it's easier as a politician to say, like, I need to respond towards the needs of a critical mass rather than your idea that it's a choice, essentially. Mr. Speaker, we think that at large, it's much easier for legislation or the championing of homosexual rights, especially in states like Delaware or Illinois. That was how the movement started, essentially, right? When both sides of the parties, when both spectrums, in fact, all spectrums, those who identify themselves that they were genetically gay, and those who choose to identify with homosexuality, band as one under the same banner to fight for the same rights of equality and social acceptance. Mr. Speaker, at the end of this speech, at the end of the opening opposition, we tell you, right, that your idea that homosexuality is a choice can only exist and can only be championed in states that already acknowledge your rights anyway. We think that you discriminate or you victimize the biggest group of individuals under this premise, which are those in the conservative states who have no way to champion their rights as homosexuals as well. And we tell you why that you should all the end goal of social acceptance. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the Leader of Opposition. And to start off the closing half of this debate, I'd like to invite the member.
Mr. Speaker, from closing, we're going to give you an important aspect of the need of the sort of movement that side opposition stands for today. We're going to tell you why that's an idea that's fundamentally dependent on sympathy from the rest of society. And we're going to explain to you in detail why harboring an entire movement on the basis of the sympathy of others is particularly bad in terms of ensuring its acceptance in the long term. We'll also talk to you about why the critical mass argument falls in favor of government side. But before all of that, let's get this out of the way, right?
What we want to do is to abandon a claim that this is not a matter of choice. The implication of having such a claim in the first place is that alternative claims cannot come up and are not given the same weightage, which means that by abandoning this claim, it is our side of the house that is in fact providing more space for alternative claims to come up, which means we are indeed giving space for people who think that they are homosexual as a result of being born that way to exist that way. But the key question in this debate is what the homosexual and LGBT movement should be adopting as its position. We are giving you the space to differ from us, but the question is what is better in the long-term interest of the movement? And in that sense, we are proud to stand in terms of saying that we should respect it as a matter of choice. Why is this so? Fundamentally, and here's the critical extension that we provide you. When you say that something is not a matter of choice, when you say that I was born this way and I therefore deserve your tolerance, it is simply that. It's tolerance and not acceptance. The reason for that is because that's an idea that's based on sympathy from the rest of society. First of all, we think that the idea of sympathy is frankly insulting to the LGBT community, because sympathy implies that you are already in an inferior position to everyone else in society. It states that the normal position is to be straight and that you are somehow inferiorly different, and because of that you deserve some amount of tolerance from the rest of the community. We think that this rejects the fundamental idea that the LGBT movement, which is that of true equality. We think that there is hypocrisy when it comes to the heterosexual movement, right? Heterosexuals can choose to be a wide variety of people on the spectrum of heterosexuality. They can choose to be openly, aggressively heterosexual. They can choose to be meek people who people sometimes make fun of as almost gay people. But when it comes to the gay community itself, right, we think that this sort of an option is denied to them because they're seen as one sort of an inferior choice that exists. And that's the sort of inequality that we want to correct. But there's also further harms when it comes to harboring your movement and anchoring it to the idea of sympathy. Because fundamentally, sympathy is a concept that's dependent on the people who provide that sympathy, which means that it can be terminated when you no longer agree with the fundamentals of the person to whom you are giving this tolerance. For example, as long as we think, as long as I'm a heterosexual who is sympathetic towards gay community, as long as they conform to some basic ideas of morality that I have, as long as, for example, I don't think they're engaging in radical expressions of their belief, radical expressions of their choice, I might be okay with extending my sympathy to them. The moment they violate my individual sense of morality as a heterosexual person, I stop this idea of sympathy. Because unlike equality, which is a fundamental concept that can't be terminated, sympathy is dependent on me giving it to them and I can terminate it. And this is also the response to their idea, right, about tying this up with feelings of religion. So they say, for example, that some people might want to think that God created me in this way and that that's a way of getting acceptance for that. The problem with that is that you're again tying it with a movement that can choose at any time to discard you as a part of its teachings. So especially in a state like Qatar or something, which is what they spoke about, right? If you have a religious leader who now one day comes and says that we don't think God created you this way, that religious teachings doesn't allow you to do this way, that's the end of your acceptance. Because it was always dependent on being tied to an independent idea. In contrast, if it was an idea of equality that was propagating your movement, it becomes that much harder to displace it because it's no longer dependent on the acceptance of someone else. But more importantly, even, we think that there's this idea of times of crisis, because we think that fundamentally, especially when it comes to certain things such as the radical gay pride marches that we have been increasingly seeing in society, those are occasions when the rest of society often does feel that the sort of actions the gay community is engaging in doesn't fit in with their idea of acceptable behavior. We think that particularly when these instances occur, which challenge your idea of acceptable behavior from the gay community, it becomes that much more easier for you to reject the idea that they deserve sympathy any longer. Because sympathy is dependent on them being on the good end of spectrum of behavior that you as an individual, as a heterosexual individual, have set for them. And we think that's a problem, particularly in times of crisis, because we do think that the LGBT movement today faces a horde of challenges, and often the only way to bring attention to these challenges is by engaging in ways of protest, ways of expression that do not meet the normal standards defined by other people. And we think that this is quite seen, right? Like, if you take the feminist movement, for example, a lot more people are comfortable with the idea of recognizing Emma Watson as a feminist because she conforms to our ideas of what a woman should be like. whereas a lot less people will be comfortable with the idea of accepting someone like Nicki Minaj as a feminist, because the behavior she exhibits isn't in conformity with what society thinks is acceptable behavior from a feminist. This sort of logic will also apply to the gay community, and your behavior now becomes dependent on others' acceptance, and your status of sympathy is also dependent on conforming to others' standards of acceptance. But before I go on, I'll take close.
Okay, so don't you believe that it's a fundamental precept of this movement to try and move people away from this sort of societal implications of what it means to be gay, what it means to be gay?
Exactly, which is why we want to anchor this movement to something that isn't dependent on conforming with people's ideas of how you should be behaving as if you are a member of the LGBT movement. As long as you do that, you're making your acceptance contingent on the ability of others to tolerate you, and that's a problem that we wanted to solve. But secondly, let's also deal with this idea that this will somehow reduce critical mass within the LGBT movement. Here's where we begin to give you the extension of why, in fact, it's the opposite. That when you have a movement that recognizes diversity and allows different varieties of the movement to exist within itself, then it means that it can latch onto the gains made by each of those sections. So the gains made by the radical LGBT movement in terms of bringing attention to their causes is something that can profit the other factions of the movement itself. And we have historically seen that this happens. Right? So when the civil rights movement against white supremacy, initially radical civil rights libertarians tried to distinguish themselves from the moderate ones, which means that the gains made by each of these movements could not translate into benefits for the other one, which meant that the movement as a whole was initially weakened in its fight against the domination that they were fighting. We think that critical mass and the coming together of these communities is also, in fact, stronger on our side of the house. And for that reason also, we think that it's important to provide the space by abandoning this dominant claim that the LGBT was a biological function rather than a choice. For those reasons, we are very proud to do this.
Thank you very much. Member of Government. Now, start the case of closing opposition. That please have the member of opposition.
It please the House. Today, we've seen a debate that has revolved around ideological principles, but which hasn't considered what it means for an actual gay person, an actual member of this movement, to have this motion passed by the House today. What we need today is a type of debate that focuses on grounding the debate to what it means to real people, and a debate that compares the harms of this motion to the benefits of keeping the status quo. So today, I'm going to tell you why. If we keep the status quo instead of adopting this motion, we will see a greater increase in rights for gay people on a societal level and a better ability for LGBTIQ people to accept themselves on a level, something which we missed out totally on the debate. But before that, I'm going to come with a few rebuttals. So first, I want to talk about this whole, their side is the side that's protecting the choice issue, right? When we look at the motion, we just have heard from a lot of the opening house on the government side, hearing a lot about how, well, right now, people who don't agree with the idea of the status quo are being excluded from the LGBT movement. That's simply not true, in fact. Trying to portray the movement as this big monolith is not an accurate characterization of what the status quo looks like. We are not saying in the status quo that everybody has to agree that homosexuality is not a choice. That's not what the LGBTIQ movement looks like in the status quo. That fundamental mischaracterization is why they feel like this motion is increasing choice. In fact, it's not. Their motion is doing the opposite, because it is saying that an entire movement, which now is imposing this monolithic standard, is now abandoning a certain claim. This, by definition, is excluding people who agree with that claim. So it's side, no, sit down. It's not their side that increases choice. Their side is telling people who have a fundamental belief about themselves that they do not have a place within a movement. They are rejecting acceptance, they are rejecting equality, they are rejecting choice. And that's why I'm proud to oppose this motion. Go ahead.
Old people who relate to a new movement, are they included in the new movement as well?
So here's the thing, if we now go from one LGBT movement that's all about acceptance into, well, we have the like biological and the pro like choice or whatever LGBT movements, you're eliminating the ability for the movement to work towards sexual function. What I'm saying is that in the status quo, the LGBT movement is sit the fuck down. But in the status quo, the LGBT movement is about choice. That's what we're talking about today, and they're trying to misrepresent the situation of what the status quo looks like. No. So let's move on to my second rebuttal. When we're talking about like helping the cause issue, that'll be talked about in my extension, and that'll cover most of opening as well as their extension. But I want to talk about this whole sympathy assumption that they're talking about in the extension made in the member speech. So they assume entirely that the reason that people would be having more acceptance under this model that they propose is because of sympathy. But they never told us why sympathy specifically is going to do that. Now, the problems that they raise are perhaps valid problems. I say that, it really is not necessarily a good thing that society makes judgment about what it is to be a gay person or what it is to be a man or a woman. But that's what the movement is about trying to solve. What they don't understand is that the problem that they identify is not a problem within is not a problem because of what we choose this definition to be. It's a problem within society. And that problem is not something that is solved in any way, shape, or form by passing this motion. If they want to prove that, they have to show that directly the fact that sexuality is not a choice, if that is what they're saying. They have to alone directly linked into all these issues that they provided. They have no link there, and in my extension, I'm going to tell you why, in fact, the opposite is true. So let's begin with two extensions today. The first is, what does this tell individuals who are LGBTIQ about themselves? Something that we haven't talked about. If we're going to say what a movement is like, we have to look at what that means to the rank and file member, to the average person who's going to be involved. And this has been something that is absolutely crucial. I'm going to give you four main points under this today. First is that it places the agency of someone who is LGBTIQ upon themselves. It says that they have made a choice. That's fundamental, right? Every choice is a choice. Now, giving agency does one specific thing, right? When you give agency, you also imply responsibility for an action, which leads to the second point, which is that as a result of this, people who are LGBT, who do identify as LGBTIQ, now are going to be we're going to see as a society sort of blaming them for what society in a religious sense or in a cultural sense sees as a negative action. You have now placed the responsibility on these people who are rank and file members. So what does that mean if I'm a gay person who wants to come out or something like that, right? It means that if I've been told, if I've been pressured by my church, if I've been pressured by my family for years and years and years that it is a sin to be gay, and now I'm also being told that even the movement that's trying to that it's a choice, then that creates cognitive dissonance that I can't get around. I'm going to say, well, maybe I am gay, but it's a choice, right? I can be straight. I can force myself to be straight. Maybe I should go to a pray away the gays camp, right? That's the implication towards a rank and file member that their motion has. The implication places agency in a negative fact on the individual. It makes it so that societal influence with choice becomes predominant in a way that prevents the individual from having their own ability to actualize. It's not an issue over whether or not we're allowing people into a movement because we are creating this standard. What it is an issue is that if we pass their motion, we are excluding people on a personal level and making it harder for people to agree in this way. So, moving on to my second extension, which is that what does this imply for the societal movement as a whole? Now, opening came up here and they talked about how this is going to impact the movement, but we never saw what the actual gains or harms are going to happen in a direct sense if we have this motion, right? So I'm going to come up and tell you those right now. First, let's look at developing economies, and particularly let's look at the LGBTIQ movement in Africa, right? So here we have a history of religious tradition imposed by colonialism that is trying to say that homosexuality is inherently a sin. If we go to the definition that they're trying to use, that it is a choice, you fundamentally harm the ability of people in those societies to agitate for equality and freedom. The reason is that now you are allowing for the religious narrative, which is that the religious narrative is that has been a choice, to become accepted by the people who are trying to fight against that very narrative. What you are doing is giving ammunition to the enemy in an ideological war. That is fundamentally ineffective. When we're talking about the issues that this has with society and issues with the individual, we have to ask ourselves, what does choice imply for the individual? What does choice imply for society? And we have shown conclusively under closing opposition that what happens under this motion is not an ability for gay people to self-actualize better. It's more oppression by society, it's more oppression onto the individual, and it's harm for everyone involved.
Thank you very much. Member of opposition. Now, to conclude with this case, I'd like to invite the government.
When Lady Gaga sang the song Born This Way and championed the rights of individuals who did not have a choice in their sexual orientations, as one of the main ambassadors of the LGBTQ movement, there was one of those instances that reflected that this was an active claim made by the LGBTQ movement that was exclusive, which means it didn't accommodate other claims like you could also choose to be gay. It was a statement of fact that said this was something that we did not choose, we were born this way. So if you assess burdens correctly, abandoning this claim automatically allows us to accommodate people who choose to be gay, or even people who choose to believe that they were born gay to begin with. But the alternative here is, if you come up here and argue to me that all your harms exist, and the second thing is, we are also happy to argue that in the long term, we are more than happy to champion that maybe homosexuality should be a choice, because we do think that grounds actual debate into context of equality rather than sympathy to begin with. The irony on this side of the house is all the harms they talk about, people getting confused and bigotry, is not mutually exclusive. If you claim to also accommodate people who choose to be gay, or people who were born gay to begin with, we think that is still a cop-out or defense when gay people or like religious people still say, but you could be choosing to be gay, right? And that lack of an actual streamlined message or a fundamental moral message also harms your case to begin with. So you can't have your cake and eat it. You have to pick one or the other. I'm going to do two questions for you today. What helps gay people in the long run? What helps gay people in the short run? So the first thing, what helps gay people in the long run? We think it's important because we came up here and told you that sympathy is not good. Because sympathy as a defense against bigotry by society when they call you out for being unnatural or an abomination is problematic. Because if your only response is, I'm sorry, I was born this way and I cannot help who I am, the immediate reaction that comes to that is to dismiss you as a birth tragedy, not so much accepting that you also have equal rights. And that is the link that they fail to establish in this debate. Sure, maybe people will feel more sympathetic, maybe people will reduce the amount of hatred they have for you because you choose the kinds of orientation you have. But why does that necessarily mean that people will be willing to extend what they perceive as exclusively secular rights like marriage unto you? And that's where the progression stops. So the end point of saying that this is the fact that we are born this way as a defense against bigotry and societal oppression is always going to stop at tolerance and sympathy. So on the first level, we think by allowing you to say that no, this maybe is a choice, maybe this should be a choice, and that's how we should actually portray this as a political battle is important, because fundamentally it allows you the end point of the actual success to be much higher when you say this is about equality, not about your sympathy. So what if I'm gay, and so what if I chose to be gay anyway? Marriage is an inherent equal right, and choice is something that's inherently granted to everyone, and therefore that is why we think this main idea of sympathy should be dispelled, and we are more than willing to say that maybe it should be a choice, and that's how we should do it. But secondly, we also told you that it allows you to ground the actual debate into a context of whether or not this is equal, like whether or not they should deserve equality. So you don't allow people's subjective moral preferences to come in the way of deciding what we think is something you inherently deserve. The right of equal marriage, the right of having a choice to decide who you love and who you want to be with. The fact that sympathy allows the people to accommodate people's moral insensitivities is problematic, and that's what we say was wrong. Second thing, we told you that sympathy can be easily terminated, right? Because if I think that I want to show you some sympathy, that comes with some conditions on what kind of behavior I expect from you. So I expect it to be in a moderate spectrum of the gay man that isn't so overtly gay in my face, and I'm then willing to accept that, fine, you're a tragedy, I will not hate you, you're not that much of an abomination, and I don't see the need to shame you for every way and for everything you do to begin with. But the moment you deviate from that very moderate characterization of what it means to be a gay man, whether it's militant gay people, whether it's Mustafa, we think people like this is where it becomes problematic. you're far less likely to accept them because you think you have a right to decide what their lives and what their behaviors should be like because they are people who are born abominations to begin with. That's the second reason why we told you that sympathy is something you cannot ground this on. We should abandon the claim entirely. And even if that means we only have to give an alternate claim, we are happy to say that it should be a choice. Before I go on, opening.
In every state that has come to the accepting of equality, the first pushing factor was always sympathy first. What is different about the other conservative states now that you cannot replicate the same process?
No, we think that the problem with sympathy is that the end point is always going to be like tolerance. We haven't seen in Bible that states people moving past the point of not going around calling gay people, you faggot, you idiot, you things. We think maybe it's ended that, but it has never really actually progressed into an actual debate about whether people deserve gay marriage or not. And that's why it's an unrealistic endpoint. Why is the second question? Why is this something that's problematic for the short run? And this is where opening opposition and closing opposition came up and said it defeats bigotry because we can say your God made them that way. Again, like I told you earlier, that essentially still means that I will treat you like someone who's like a mentally handicapped person. Also born this way, but very different from whether or not you actually deserve the same amount of rights that I do, right? And that's problematic because we think it's a cop-out. And we also think it's a cop-out because if you seek to claim or accommodate the narrative that it could also be a choice, then religious people could also use that against you to defeat and you or to stand against your defense of bigotry because they can still say that, oh, maybe you chose to be gay, maybe you were born gay. And the fact that there is no streamlined narrative also means that your harms apply in your model as well. The second thing here to say is this diametrically opposes people, and this is also closing opposition, from being religious or from being homosexual to begin with. The problem is that if this narrative that you're born this way narrative exists right now, that means that I can be religious and I can be gay. Only if I suppress my sexual orientations as part of the mandate of the church or the greatest of greater religious scripture to begin with. So I must suppress my desires, and that's the only way I don't have that diametrical opposition of being homosexual or being religious. If I suppress my innermost being and my innermost entity, and I choose to accept this is a burden that is from God, and I attend church every day without expressing my identity. That's not a fair endpoint for any homosexual out there. But secondly, we also told you that if you allow people to express that they chose to be gay, sure, it's harder to bring a man like that into church because clearly he insists that this is something that he could be choosing, and maybe that's not a choice that the homosexual agenda made for him when they abandoned the claim entirely. But at the very least, the end goal of making sure that he deserves equal marriage is much better. He will never have to feel the case to suppress his innermost sexual preferences to actually live and not be in church. So on two grounds, Mr. Speaker, we told you that on the long run, sympathy is not something we should ground debate and discussion. We told you it's not a good endpoint for homosexuals, but we told you even in the short run, as a mechanism against bigotry, we still think it's allowing the idea that you are a burden or you're an abomination still allows you to be brought to church and suppress the kind of innermost desires you have. For all these reasons, we're very proud to take this.
Thank you very much, Dr. And now to conclude this quarterfinals, I invite the opposition.
Two giant assumptions coming out from government bench, right? Firstly, the assumption that gays are treated the same throughout the world, that gays face the same problems throughout the world. We said that that's not the case. Gays are not a single thing that you can pluck out of Uganda and place in the USA and treat exactly the same way. What works under their model? So even if we accept that their entire model is the correct model to follow in, say, like suburban USA, that model is completely inappropriate to apply in Uganda, where you can get executed publicly for declaring that you're homosexual, right? We think that circumstances are radically different. This is something that they have to acknowledge. Secondly, Kanna has come up with the interesting claim that you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say that you're born this way and you maybe have a choice, right? And like somehow we need to make a choice and there cannot be multiplicity of discourse within a movement. But that's completely factually untrue, right? Because this entire movement is about inquisition, right? It's about us
is about inclusivity, right? Like, it's about asking questions, right? Like it's discovering your identity, right? And that's precisely why we must have this multiplicity of discourse, right? Because under your circumstance, you shut out a third or a half of people who believe that, like, you know, oh, I really was born this way, or I really do have a choice, right? And you shut these people out of discourse completely. We don't think that allows for like integration, right? Or pushing for rights, or making these people feel connected to the global movement at all. So, two major questions. Firstly, how do we prevent discrimination? I will tackle closing government's entire extension on, like, you know, how having a movement depending on sympathy is bad. 3 assumptions underlying their case, and those are completely ridiculous assumptions. Firstly, the claim that having sexuality is, if you have the claim that sexuality is not the choice, then the movement is dependent on sympathy. But that's not true, right? Because by that logic, all things dependent on not choices are based on sympathy. Like, we should therefore say that Martin Luther King should have advocated that being black was not the choice. I chose to be black, ladies and gentlemen, because I had a dream. No, that's not the case, right? That's patently absurd, right? But let me finish that sub for you. I'm CG now, and I'm saying that in order to have sympathy for someone just for being born gay, you have to equate gay with some kind of physical disability, right? That's what Kanna wants to prove. But that's patently not what the LGBTQ movement is about, right? That's patently false. We are not sure where they're pulling their assumptions from. Secondly, second big assumption was that the LGBTQ movement is currently based on sympathy. Again, that's not true, right? Their opening, I mind you, came out and said that the goal of the LGBTQ movement is not about sympathy, but about, i.e., equality, right? Equal treatment in the eyes of the law. There's a tension in the case here, Mr. Speaker. You need to look at that. But say that sympathy is contingent on conforming to certain gay stereotypes. We think that's patently untrue, right? Because it's in fact, it's when people deviate from the stereotypes of what it means to be gay, then people realize that being gay isn't an all-consuming thing of identity. Not all gays are linked to wristed, right? And there's more to being gay than what traditionally. This leads me on to my third big problem with their entire extension. No, thank you, Bryan. Right? We are conforming to society's notion of what gay is, and that's bad because they can drop this sympathy at any time, like a hot potato. But let's do a very simple compare and contrast, right? Even if we agree with their extension and we only have their sympathy at their pleasure, under your paradigm, people have no sympathy for gays at all. Why? Apparently, they're not religious, because let me tell you how a religious mind works, right? It's far worse for someone to choose to be a heathen than to be born a heathen. That's why apostates are punished even harsher than non-believers, right? Which is why even in secular societies, people feel more sympathy for a person who was born with a congenital heart disease or was born with a propensity for lung cancer than someone who got lung cancer from smoking 3 packs a day, right? That's why a choice is fundamental. Really harmful to have that kind of sympathy in the first place. No, thank you, right? And Jay has already talked about this, but we say it's better to accept people with like a certain level of tolerance rather than rejecting people outright as heathens who made a choice to live in a life of sin. And again, even if the entire case works in America, it's not applicable worldwide, because we recognize that the gay community is far more diverse than that. That we are talking about LGBTQ movement that is global. They have narrowed down the conception. They have a very specific characterization of the problems that the gay person faces, about the family that a gay person is born in. We don't think that that applies for everything. This is an assumption that has to fall, right?
Sympathy aside or not, we already accept that people can make choices for helping other people. Don't you think it is good that the platform this discussion about rights for
exactly like me, because brilliant, right? Bryan came up in his speech to talk about, the choice to identify as male has nothing to do whatsoever with the fact that I was born a male. This is patently wrong, right? Because the fact that I'm born male or Chinese or black has a fundamental impact on how I start to identify myself to begin with, right? I can change. Yes, I can choose to identify as a female. Yes, but that's the problem, right? That's why transsexuals have so much problem coming out as something that as a different sex from their biological sex, right? Which is why there's this initial inertia in place. Clearly, there is some kind of biological sex that you're born with, or the biological sexual orientation that you may be born with, plays in the development of the individual. No, thank you. And even if it is not, even if it's completely made by choice, how is this choice made, right? Choice is determined by your environmental circumstances, on the country you're born in, on the family you're born in, and these things I did not choose, right? Even if it's a choice, if I'm born into a white suburban American family, I could 90% choose to be gay. But this choice was fostered on circumstances that were completely out of my control, done by the birth lottery, right? So even if it's choice, it's not a free choice in any sense of the word, which they are trying to propose for. Lastly, Bryan's ludicrous point on if they don't like it, then you just leave the movement, right? But opening has already said we can leave the movement anyway, and that is true. But clearly they don't understand the problems that are facing a majority of LGBT across the world, right? You can't just leave a movement because the movement is all you have, right? When your conservative Christian parents kick you out of the home at 17 years old and have no contact left in the world, you can't just I don't like this movement, I suppose I'll make it out on my own, right? That option isn't open to you, right? Principally, if the LGBTQ movement is founded on something that is meant to be non-discriminatory, we don't understand why it discriminates against people who hold that particular belief that they were born this way. Because Jay has talked to you about how we better help individuals who feel that what it means to be an self, and why this is so particularly important in the context of the LGBTQ movement of all things. Go with side closing off.
Thank you very much, Thank you everyone for the final, score, shake hands. The results will be announced in the hall.